For 17 years, James kept the last photograph of his older sister, Alisa, frozen in time, a smiling teenager posing with her new bicycle on the cusp of the Blackwood Forest. The official story was that she got lost, a tragic hiking accident that left no trace. But James always felt a splinter of doubt, a memory of the strange car he saw near the trail that day, a detail the police dismissed. Now, in the autumn of 1995, a record-breaking drought has cracked the valley's creek bed open, revealing a secret the water has held for nearly 2 decades. It's amazing how a single discovery can change everything we thought we knew. Before we uncover the truth of what happened that day, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about a time a small detail completely changed your perspective on a past event. The photograph sat on the mantelpiece in James's small home, a silent testament to a life cut short. He was 30 now, a carpenter whose hands were calloused and capable, but whose heart still held a space of unresolved grief that had shaped the man he'd become. He was quiet, thoughtful, and had never married. It was hard to build a future when your past was a constant, nagging question mark. He remembered that day in 1978 with the painful clarity of childhood trauma. He had been 13, watching from the porch as his 17-year-old sister, Alisa, prepared for her bike ride. The light blue cruiser was brand new, a birthday gift she adored. She had waved to him, her long brown hair tied back, her smile bright and full of life. "Don't wait up, squirt," she had called out before pedaling down the gravel driveway toward the forest trailhead. She was supposed to be gone for an hour, maybe 2. She never came back. The search had lasted for weeks. Police, volunteers, and his own frantic parents had combed every inch of Blackwood Forest. They found nothing. No bike, no footprints, no sign of a struggle. The sheriff at the time, a man weary from years of small-town problems, concluded she must have taken a wrong turn on an unmarked trail, gotten lost, and succumbed to the elements. A tragic accident. His parents had eventually accepted it, the weight of not knowing slowly crushing their spirits until they, too, were gone. But James never could. He remembered seeing an unfamiliar rusty brown sedan parked near the trail entrance when he'd walked down to the mailbox earlier that day. He'd told the sheriff, but the detail was dismissed as irrelevant. Kids see cars all the time. It meant nothing. For 17 years, that rusty brown car had been parked in the back of his mind. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, interrupting the low hum of his table saw. He wiped sawdust from his hands and answered, expecting a client. Instead, it was a voice from the past. "James, this is Sheriff Gary Miller. You might not remember me, but I was a deputy back when your sister went missing." James's grip tightened on the phone. Gary Miller. He remembered him as a young, earnest deputy who had at least seemed to listen. "I remember you," James said, his voice steady. "What's this about?" The sheriff sounded cautious, his tone measured. "Look, I don't want you to get your hopes up. But we might have something. The drought we've been having, it's the worst in a century. Blackwood Creek is almost completely dry. A couple of kids were down there skipping rocks and found something stuck in the mud." James held his breath. What did they find? Sheriff Gary took a slow breath before answering. "A bicycle, James, a rusted-out frame of a light blue cruiser. It was buried deep in the old creek bed, the part that's usually under 10 feet of water." A jolt went through James, so powerful it felt like an electric shock. Hope, an emotion he had buried long ago, clawed its way to the surface. He didn't need to ask for more details. He knew. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice thick. He hung up the phone, his hands shaking. He looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece, at Elisa's smiling face. Someone had put her bike in that creek. It wasn't an accident. And after 17 years of silence, the truth was finally starting to surface. The 2-hour drive to his hometown of Harmony Creek was a blur of familiar highways and a storm of unfamiliar emotions. When he arrived at the small sheriff's station, Gary Miller was waiting for him. The man's hair was grayer, his face lined with the stress of his job, but his eyes were still kind. He led James to an evidence garage without much small talk, and there it was. Lying on a blue tarp was a mangled, rust-covered bicycle. The tires were gone, rotted away, and the frame was caked in dried mud and algae. But the color, a faint, mottled, light blue, was still visible. James knelt, his fingers tracing the twisted metal of the handlebars. Then he saw it. On the front fender, there was a small, distinct dent. A wave of memory washed over him. He had made that dent himself, wobbling into a fence post while Alisa was teaching him how to ride it in their backyard. He'd been 7 years old. "It's hers," he said, his voice cracking. "This is Alisa's bike." Sheriff Gary nodded grimly. "I figured as much. We're officially reopening the case. But James, I have to be honest with you. This is a 17-year-old cold case. The trail is frozen solid. Most of the original files are incomplete, and people's memories fade. My resources are limited." James stood up, a new resolve hardening his features. "Then I'll find the resources," he said. "I'll do it myself." That night he drove to his parents' old house, which had stood empty for years. He let himself in, the air thick with the smell of dust and memories. In the attic, he found what he was looking for: boxes of Alisa's belongings he could never bring himself to throw away. He spent hours under the dim light of a single bare bulb, sifting through yearbooks, photo albums, and finally a small, leather-bound diary. He sat on the dusty floor and began to read. The pages were filled with the typical thoughts of a teenage girl: dramas with friends, complaints about homework, dreams of going to college. It was a painful, beautiful glimpse into the life he had lost. Then, in the entries from the spring of 1978, a new name appeared: Jason, a boy from her art class. At first, she described him as just quiet and a little strange, but the tone of the entries slowly changed. "Jason drew another picture of me in class today," she wrote. "He didn't even ask. He just stares sometimes. It's starting to make me feel weird." A week later, another entry. "I told him I wasn't interested in going to the spring dance with him. He got so quiet. It was like a shudder came down over his face. He just walked away without saying a word. It was scarier than if he had yelled." James felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was more than a teenage crush. This was an obsession. He flipped through the matching high school yearbook until he found the name: Jason Moore. The photo showed a boy with intense dark eyes and a thin, unsmiling mouth. He was a loner, not listed in any clubs or sports teams. He was a ghost in the pages, just as he had been a ghost in Alisa's life. This was his first real lead. James knew he needed more than a few diary entries. He needed to talk to someone who was there, someone who might have seen what he couldn't. Alisa's best friend had been a girl named Lori Jenkins. He wondered if she was still around. A quick search of the phone book the next morning gave him his answer. There was an L. Jenkins in the neighboring town of Cedar Falls. He dialed the number, his heart pounding. A woman's voice answered. "Hello? Is this Lori Jenkins?" James asked. There was a pause. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is James. I'm Alisa's brother." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with the weight of 17 years. "My God," Lori whispered. "James, of course, what is it?" He explained about the bike, about reopening the case. He asked if she would be willing to meet with him, to talk about Alisa and those last few weeks. She agreed without hesitation. They met at a small coffee shop halfway between their towns. Lori was a woman now with faint lines around her eyes, but James could still see the teenager she had been. Her expression was a mixture of sadness and apprehension. "I've thought about her every day," Lori said, stirring her coffee. "I always felt like I should have known something, done something." "You were just a kid," James said gently. "We all were. But I need to ask you about someone. A boy named Jason Moore." Lori's eyes widened and a flicker of fear crossed her face. "Jason," she breathed. "I haven't thought about him in years. He was creepy." She then told James everything. She confirmed that Jason had been fixated on Alisa. He would leave strange, anonymous notes in her locker, poems that were both romantic and unsettling. He would show up at the diner where she worked part-time and just sit in a corner booth, watching her. Alisa was kind to everyone, Lori explained. She tried to let him down easy when he asked her to the dance, but after she said no, he changed. He started following her home from school, staying in the shadows. She told me she was scared of him. She was going to tell her parents that weekend, but she never got the chance. "Why didn't you tell the police any of this back then?" James asked, his voice tight with frustration. Lori looked down at her hands, ashamed. "I did, sort of. I mentioned he was weird, but I was a scared 16-year-old girl. I didn't think they'd take me seriously. It sounded like petty high school drama. I never imagined he could actually hurt her." But now, the discovery of the bike changed everything. It wasn't just drama anymore. It was a motive, a quiet, obsessive boy, a painful rejection, and a girl who vanished days later. The official story of a hiking accident had just crumbled to dust. James now had a name, a motive, and a direction. His hunt for the truth had finally begun. He thanked Lori for her honesty and asked one final question. "Do you have any idea where Jason lived?" Lori thought for a moment, then her eyes lit up with a distant memory. "It was an old farmhouse, I think, on the edge of the Blackwood Forest. His family was pretty reclusive. They had a big property that bordered the state park, not too far from the creek." With that crucial piece of information, James drove to the county clerk's office. He spent the afternoon poring over dusty property maps and tax records from the late 70s. He found it, a large plot of land registered to a Harold Moore, Jason's father. The property line ran right along the northern edge of Blackwood Creek. He then checked the current records. The Moore family had sold the farm in the early 80s, but a smaller 5-acre parcel of that original land had been sold again just 2 years ago, in 1993. The buyer's name made the hair on James's arm stand up. Jason Moore. He had come back. After all these years, the man who had haunted his sister's final days was living less than a mile from where her bicycle had been hidden in the water. James felt a surge of cold fury. He drove straight there, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He knew it was reckless. He should have gone to Sheriff Gary with his findings, but he couldn't wait. He needed to see the man's face, to look him in the eye. He found the turnoff, a private gravel road marked with a faded wooden sign that read, "Moore." At the end of the road was a small, run-down cabin, smoke curling from a stone chimney. Multiple no trespassing signs were nailed to the trees. A man was in the yard, his back to the road, splitting firewood with a heavy axe. He was older, his hair thinner, but the broad shoulders and tense posture were the same as in the yearbook photo. It was him. James got out of his truck and walked slowly up the drive. The crunch of gravel under his boots made the man turn around. His eyes, just as intense as James remembered from the photograph, narrowed with suspicion. "This is private property," Jason said, his voice a low growl. He rested the axe by the chopping block but kept it within reach. "I know," James said, stopping a respectful distance away. "My name is James. I'm Alisa's brother." He watched for a reaction, a flicker of guilt, of surprise, anything. But Jason's face was a stone mask. "Don't know who that is," he lied. "You should leave." "Her bicycle was just found," James pressed on, his voice shaking slightly. "In the creek, just down the hill from here, after 17 years. This time he saw it. A muscle in Jason's jaw twitched. His grip on the axe handle tightened. "That has nothing to do with me," Jason spat, his voice laced with venom. "Now get off my land before I call the sheriff." "I already talked to him," James said, taking a step closer. "And I talked to Lori Jenkins. She told me everything, Jason, about how you followed her, about how she was scared of you." Jason's composure finally broke. A dark rage ignited in his eyes. "She was supposed to be with me," he roared, taking a step forward. "She was perfect. But she laughed at me. She chose that idiot football player over me." The confession hung in the air, raw and violent. In that moment, James knew he was standing face to face with the man who had taken his sister's life. Jason continued, his voice a torrent of long-held bitterness. "I just wanted to talk to her. I followed her onto the trail that day. I just wanted to make her see." He was lost in the memory, his eyes wild. But she wouldn't listen. She told me to leave her alone. She called me a creep. He took another step, his body trembling with the memory of his fury. We were on the old overlook, that narrow ledge. I grabbed her arm. I just wanted her to listen. But she pulled away. She stumbled. He stared at James, his face a mask of horror and self-pity. She fell. It was an accident. I never meant to. He trailed off, the weight of his lie too heavy to carry any longer. He had watched her fall into the rocky chasm below. He had panicked. Knowing no one would believe it was an accident, he had climbed down a different path to the creek bed. She was gone, taken by the fast-moving water. But her bike was there, on the bank. In a frenzy, he had dragged it into the deepest part of the creek, weighting it down with rocks, burying the only evidence that tied him to her disappearance. He thought the water would keep his secret forever. As Jason's confession poured out, a sound broke the stillness of the forest, the crunch of tires on the gravel road. A sheriff's patrol car came into view, its lights off, rolling slowly up the drive. Sheriff Gary stepped out, his hand resting on his service weapon. James had called him from a payphone just before he turned onto Jason's road, telling him his suspicions and where he was going. He had asked the sheriff to give him 5 minutes alone. Jason stared at the officer, his face crumbling from rage into utter defeat. It was over. The secret he had carried for 17 years had finally been dragged into the light. The sheriff cuffed him without a struggle, the fight having drained out of him completely. In the days that followed, search teams scoured the chasm below the overlook, but Alisa's remains were never found. The creek and the forest had claimed her body long ago. But the truth, at last, was out. Jason Moore was charged and convicted of murder, his confession in the yard sealing his fate. A few weeks later, James stood by the edge of Blackwood Creek. The drought had eased and the water was flowing again, clear and cold over the rocks. He was alone. In his hand, he held the faded photograph from his mantelpiece. He knelt and gently placed it on a flat stone at the water's edge, letting the current lap at its edges. The pain of her loss would never fully disappear, but the agonizing burn of uncertainty was finally gone. He had an answer. He had found justice for Alisa. He watched the photograph until the water carried it away, a final goodbye. And for the first time in 17 years, James felt a sense of peace. The outro Jason's confession claimed Alisa's fall was an accident during their struggle, but his actions afterward, hiding the bike and keeping silent for 17 years, were deliberate. Do you believe a person should be judged solely on their initial act, or do the years of deceit that follow define their true character? Let us know what you think. If stories like this, where the past refuses to stay buried, resonate with you, consider subscribing to our channel. We're dedicated to uncovering these powerful tales and sharing them with you.